Okay, so welcome back, everybody. Can you actually hear? I just want to check that. Is the microphone working? Good. Okay, good. And also, welcome back to everybody who's joining online. I hope many hundreds are joining online. Okay, so we're going to kick off the panel discussion. And kind of one of the themes which kind of came back for me anyway in the discussion was this idea of uncertainty. And in fact, the first question I have is I'm going to direct towards Noah. I love the comment, light subjects architecture to uncertainty, and that kind of really inspired me to ask this question. So, of course, technology can often be a disruptive influence. So my question then is, if technology, and here of course we're talking about lighting technology in terms of the electric light, have you found in your work, in your experience, that the whole discussion around LED today is actually having a disruptive influence on your work, either positive or negative in some way?
Yeah, no, I think yes, disruptive, but positive disruptive. I think in particular, I thought George had in particular kind of really enjoyed the comment about LEDs replicating sort of known light sources, and not surprising that's the way it happens, but I think what we're starting to see is the ability of LEDs to produce sort of phenomenological effects that previously weren't possible, and so you get a certain material indeterminacy that emerges out of that, and the possibility of just at the scale of material and light, being able to create things that didn't exist before in this kind of, when I talked about it on a larger scale, a sort of site, nature, man-made and nature coming together in a building in a way of creating a third condition. I think we're live in an age, and I'd love to hear all your comments on this, because I think, and also David, particularly your guys' work is about sort of material properties of these things and achieving the phenomenological effects through that. So sort of embracing that and achieving a kind of material indeterminacy and uncertainty.
I mean, George, do you have any comments on that, particularly, for example, around quality of light, which and I think it'd be sort of now sort of talking about electric light and then natural light. Do you have any comments on that linked to the quality potential of LED and then the possibilities with it?
Yeah, thanks. Well, the talks were really fascinating this afternoon about the mix of natural and electric lights, and I think LEDs do have this feature of being able to adjust so many parameters. I mentioned that we have an array of products ranging from very high power products. You can make stadium searchlights down to these small lamps that you can distribute and put them everywhere you want. You can change the spectrum to whatever you want it to be. It can be programmable, so you can change it during the day or during the region. And so I'm really interested in the design aspect. What do people really want if they weren't stuck with or didn't get down this track of the existing light sources? What really makes people happy with lighting? Is it that you'd have a thing that looked like a skylight? Only it could have clouds if you wanted to have clouds. And it could have as many clouds as you want. You could easily program it to have no clouds or a cloudy day or different amounts of clouds and different amount of wind blowing the clouds around. You can imagine all kinds of things that you could program and do with lighting. And so I think this whole idea to me is really exciting. I think the design opportunities are incredible.
And I was really interested in your comment, Davidson, about, in fact, that your choice or to not have integrate LEDs in one of your projects, which so where in your work, where is the, and of course you're a daylighting consultant, but where is the balance for you there between natural and electric light in your work?
And George and I were talking about this at the break, and I mentioned Stephen Jay Gould, who was a great anthropologist and paleontologist, who taught for years at Harvard, and he was engaged in the discussion about the relationship of science to the idea of God, and he explained them as two entirely separate magisteria, right? And part of me wants to go Stephen Jay Gould on this whole issue of LEDs and daylight, right? That they're two very separate qualities of light that we get from them, and that therefore their methods of delivery and the perceptions that we seek from those methods of delivery should engage us in two separate kinds of experiences. Then I asked George, do you think that if we had a piece of diffuse glass here and you put your LED sources behind it, and I had a diffuse piece of glass in front of a blue sky, that you could create something that was imperceptibly different? And he said yes. I'm a little bit concerned about that. I mean, it's like sort of a structural honesty in architecture, right? You don't want fake columns lying around and stuff like that. And you want to identify a column as a structural resource and not some totally other. And then George corrected me again and said that, a photon being emitted by the LED is going to be exactly the same as a photon that's being emitted through the glass. So there again, there's no distinction. Therefore, I'm having failed in that argument. I'm compelled by the suggestion from Noah that really what we're seeking is some other condition, right? And when I think about that, I think about James Turrell's Sky Spaces, where you have that puncture in the ceiling that goes up and to the sky. Your primary focus is on that sky as it changes its own photonic quality over the course of the day, particularly the evening. But then what he subtly does is he changes the surrounding light in the sky space with electric light, and for a long time it was fluorescence. I'm sure it's LEDs now. And so what he is obviously seeking in that space is some sort of third condition, and I think that in fact is where the interest lies.
Okay, so that's very interesting about the perhaps visual perception of the light, question mark whether you can tell the difference. However, Raymond, you started touching on the kind of non-visual parts, the circadian response. So have you got any comments there, Raymond, about the positive, negative, roles of natural light versus electric light in the context of the kind of non-visual part?
Yeah, I do, Matthew. But can I first follow up on what George said?
Course.
And there's one term that we haven't heard in this discussion so far yet, and that's fascination and emotion. And you were talking about clouds that come by, and I know we can make them. I've seen them, and I've seen the LED petals mimicking clouds. And sometimes this is a little bit disruptive, negatively disruptive, and sometimes it's fascinating, evoking emotions. And you, Noah, and your colleagues are clearly able to make fascinating designs of interior spaces. And Matthew asked, does it ever disrupt negatively or positively? And you said it's mostly positively. But in some of your models that you made before you really built the thing, you must have seen instances where you use daylight that actually turn out to be negatively disruptive, or is it always fascinating? And what makes fashion? What makes
Are you
fascination for
perfect?
Yeah, always fascinating.
Then I can make it as well.
No, I think we fail all the time. You don't do what we all do without. You don't build
Is there
something.
a law to it? Is there a rule? When do you fail?
Well, no, but failure I don't think necessarily has to have a negative connotation. You learn, obviously, in that. So I'd like to think that hopefully our failures happen in our studio and not in the built environment, and that is one of the reasons we test things with physical models and use all the tools at our disposal. I don't want to. We're not Luddites by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, quite the opposite. We have a 3D printer, a laser cutter, high-powered computers in our offices. But I think it's again a matter of kind of bringing as many of these tools at your disposal to advance one's own kind of research project within your studio. But I think it very much is a research project, and I think our work is a vein of research. So it's ongoing, and you do get these instances of.
I'm eager to respond because I know you can do better. It's not all trial and error, and it comes back to the first word that you mentioned, Matthew, and that's uncertainty. And here's my hypothesis, and I did a little experiment and tested it, but I first want to know your take on it. So I think what makes designs fascinating is that there is enough of predictability, namely daylight and how daylight changes over the day. And then there is the extra uncertain, unpredictable, say, stochastic element, as opposed to the deterministic element, that makes things fascinating. And if there is too much change above or beyond normal predictable changes, then it gets annoying. And if it's too boring, if there's not enough change, then, your design would turn up as being boring. Could you see that? Do you play, when you, in hindsight, is it the level of uncertainty that you play with in seeing whether a design becomes successful or not, in your trial and error?
It's an interesting question. I would like to a little bit also categorize, to a certain degree, uncertainty, because I don't think it's trial and error, and I don't think it's purely. I think it's I think there's knowledge in the intuitive way that we approach things, and accepting that there's knowledge in it, intuition. It embraces that idea. I always think of the great Morton Feldman quote: "I choose chance." And there's I don't mean to imply that there's a lack of rigor in uncertainty. In fact, quite the opposite. I think David and I were just chatting right before we sat down, but I loved his where he was trying to get at the data about rainbows in Utah. It's trying to get quantitative information to be deployed for qualitative purposes, which I think, there's a intense rigor in that. So I do want to qualify that, and then I think again each situation is unique. I don't think there's not a magic formula that says this much uncertainty and this much known, every.
Can I tell you about a little experiment I did? I used Luminous. That's big tiles of LEDs behind a blurry surface. And with Luminous you can make clouds moving by, but also a fireplace. You can mimic a fireplace. And when I'm at home and at my real fireplace, I can look for hours at the flames. But also I try to mimic this with the Luminous, and I found regimes or parameter combinations which also evoke this fascination. And there was one parameter that we could change, a knob. And that determined the level of uncertainty. So if that knob was down, then the flames were all the time at the same place and it became boring after a few seconds. But then you turn up the knob and you turn up the stochastic, the non-deterministic component. So uncertainty. And at
I need an uncertainty button.
Yeah.
I want one of those.
But then when you go up, at a certain moment, there's too much uncertainty, unpredictability, and it gets annoying. It gets chaotic. And so this uncertainty is at the heart of this fascination and emotion that it evokes, I guess. And that's what I want to follow up on the previous discussion. And we can actually quantify it now. It may not be the best parameter, but we are attempting to quantify fascination at the moment.
But I'm curious how we've also talked about sort of full sensory experiences, and while that, what you just described is an amazing precision about a primarily visual experience, I would say, but I would, or when we talk about can you replicate the cloud, visually, I'm sure you're right, but I think there's a cognitive element there that maybe where other things come into play. It's a sunny day outside. If you're seeing, a cloud, what does that mean? Or with the fire, is it the crackle of the flame or the smell of the wood that makes you sit there for a couple hours?
So the photons are the same coming from the LED, mimicking the fireplace, but of course the smell and the sound is different, and that makes a difference, of course. Yeah, true.
But if I can extend this for a second, because this is my hobby, using Raymond's terms, something that I'm particularly interested in, and this debate reminds me of a frequent family discussion that I have with my brother, who is a research scientist and an academic. Somehow we got different genes in the family, but I will present subjects to him, and he will look at me and say, "There's no scientific evidence that supports that." And it's so it's based on data, and we know, as Davidson also referenced in his presentation, showing the NREL climate chart, I think it gives us a series of averages, and we can understand within a certain realm of acceptability that these are predictable states, but they don't obviously measure every state. And I would also argue maybe they shouldn't. Having charts that help us to understand the extents possibly would be helpful, but to the point of fascination and emotion that have been also raised, these are qualitative moments that one could say are spikes on a chart that reside outside of the kind of realm of norms or averages or means. And so my fascination with this has to do with intuitive, visceral responses to conditions. So I would argue, using my own personal experiences as a measuring stick for what I do professionally and academically and otherwise, if I'm sitting in my home and I'm viewing a fire on a monitor versus understanding a fire within a volume, a fireplace, and certainly there are other multi-sensory experiences, acoustically, the smell and the feel of heat and so on. Even if you could begin to replicate those, I would assume that there would be a cognitive disparity between viewing something that is two-dimensional and experiencing something that is spatial and multidimensional. So I'm curious to know, maybe this is something that George can respond to. I'm curious to get everyone's response to this, but is this a domain that we should venture down? Is this, from the standpoint of technology, we can do a lot. We can simulate, we can create, artificial replicas of a lot of stuff. and there's a lot of that experimentation happening in the science world in a lot of domains. Is this a realm that we should be exploring deeply? Or do we, and I would say, going back to Davidson's comment about the sky reflector, what is this? Remind me of the term.
Sky mast.
Sky mast. It seems odd to me to put technology in it for a variety of reasons. But in my mind, as a designer, as a creative individual, it seems wise to make distinctions between these things, to use technology in a manner that where we can deploy it to our advantage. Obviously, these are amazing advancements that we're making and great design opportunities on a variety of levels. But do we need to replicate literally what we know in the natural world?
Yeah, it's hard to address that. What you can do certain things, and should you do certain things? I guess there's nothing really wrong with it, but somehow it seems a little dishonest to create a better and better looking fireplace. It's not a real fire. But take it an extreme. You have wood you put in and you burn it. That's one thing. Then you go to a gas log that. Okay, now that's not quite the same as burning real. Now you replace that with just, some kind of LED lights that look like the gas, an image and has a heater in it. That's at what extreme. And then you just have an LCD front thing with the fireplace on it, like I think Stephen Colbert does or something. That's still another extreme. And I don't know. It seems to me that's a personal taste kind of thing. I know I was caught up, on a is this okay thing in visiting cathedrals in Portugal this spring. Mm-hmm. And the votive candles that they have, they're replacing with LEDs in many of these things. So instead of business of buying a candle and lighting it and going through this kind of, I'm not a religious person, but I'm watching this happening. Now they drop a coin in a slot and a little LED flickers on. and I'm wondering, somehow that, I wasn't sure that was the right thing, although I love seeing LEDs in applications where they have to use before. I'm thinking, is that okay? So I understand the question. I don't really know how to answer it, I guess.
One of the things that it gets back to Raymond's seeking of pleasant experiences with light and defining some sort of zone in which one has comfort, one finds comfort. I think that one of the things that is missing in much of our lighting design, and whether it has to do with daylight or with electric light, is discomfort zones. And I'm working on this project in Jerusalem right now, and one of the characteristics of Jerusalem is that you can find light that will blind you on the rooftops. And then you can find a cave underneath the same building where you're in total darkness. And depending on where your comfort zone is, you can find it, right? And I think that one of the things that's so often missing in our architecture, and I think it applies to the thermal side as well as it does to the light side, are places where you can go to, freeze your ass in the winter or, blind yourself in the summer. I mean, just so that we can experience some of those extrema. Everything is so average that it gets disturbing, and it's one other way of disconnecting us, not from just how beautiful nature is and how wonderful, comfortable. It's violent. It will kill you. The light in Jerusalem will kill you if you're exposed to it enough. And I think exposing ourselves to those kinds of things and having buildings and designs that allow us to expose ourselves under the right circumstances, safe circumstances, are things that we should consider incorporating.
Yeah, I think it's you touched on it a little bit in your discussion, but the importance of darkness also I think is absolutely paramount. I didn't speak too much about some of the issues with that Nude Hampson project, but that project, for example, has some very uncomfortable dark corners, and that was actually an intentional narrative to reflect what I spoke about with the political ideology of that individual. It's not always a nice building. He wasn't a particularly nice person, and you know, but that's kind of part of the experience, and I don't think, you know, turning, yeah, I think it's a vital touchstone, and that you get the gamut of experience. I mean, I love the slide you had about perception of, you know, if it's all light or all dark, your brain's not working, but right in that middle zone, you know. And I took great heart when you said that you weren't adding the LEDs to your sky mass.
I said, I don't want to add them. The client has other ideas.
Resist. Sometimes your clients are wrong.
So perhaps just kind of building on that point, so it's kind of a quick question, perhaps starting with Davidson, but then for everybody. It was a theme around the dialogue between natural and electric light. So where for you, is that balance between, with the two, and how are those decisions made in your design process?
Not very well, I think would describe it. I think we're still in an uncomfortable, or I'm gonna keep Jamie out of this. I'm still uncomfortable about a lot of electric lighting. I find it much too widely deployed, much too intense in terms of its output. Much too much an extraordinary technology. Thank you, George. But I think that it's a technology that is desperately looking for something to do, and it hadn't found it yet. I think the models for most electric lighting design right now, certainly in the public domain, and unfortunately I think it's spread now, so it's pretty much a global phenomenon, is Times Square in Las Vegas. And I think that those are two really lousy models, right? I mean, it sells a lot of LEDs, but it's lousy lighting.
But what about appropriateness? Just kind of coming back on that, aren't there some in the same way that there are clearly spaces which should be dark? What about places where the people want kind of that spectacle?
Absolutely. I mean, they have Las Vegas. They have Times Square. I'm not saying that shouldn't happen, but I remember some years ago there was somebody who was proposing, and maybe it's still the case, to take Times Square downtown. I mean, it was one of the stupidest ideas I'd ever heard of. Right? I mean, there are people who live down there. What are they going to do in the middle of Times Square when their kids are trying to go to sleep? I mean, it's just it's crazy. And the idea that that will attract people, or that will raise the magnetism of the place, I think is absurd. I mean, it's just not going to happen. That said, what I'm really admitting is that I haven't found a kind of a balance point or a comfort zone where I think the two things work well together. And partly it's my own struggle to try to figure out how to take this technology that George has delivered to us or foisted upon us, and figure out a really an imaginative way of using it. And it's got to. And I think one of the things that really struck me in your presentation, and one of the things that you yearn for, is to take the potential of this LED and forget Edison, right? Yeah. Let's move on. And I think that it's not just about forgetting Edison in terms of the form factor, it's forgetting Edison in terms of those sort of classic formulations of light. And what this LED stuff provides us with an opportunity to completely reinvent it. Not simply reproduce what Times Square and Vegas have done. Now what are those reinventions? And I think once it gets to there, then I think you're going to find a more sympathetic opinion about it than I have presently. And at least a better understanding of how it might work with daylight.
So I can't resist the temptation to bring in Noah here and sort of refer to some of your work, and of course Stephen Hall's work around kind of volumes of light, because that seems to me of course, the right way maybe to apply this. Have you got any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was trying to get at, and back from your first question, and again, this kind of desire to get away from Edison in this. I do think that there's we're just very much obviously scratching the surface. I mean, the technology is far ahead of its manifestation at this point, and I think we get glimpses of it. I mean, I'm thinking, for example, in that project in Glasgow, we have a edge detail on a canopy where we have a sandwich of quadruple laminate of glass, and we're able to integrate a imperceptible LED where it's actually a canopy that passes inside and out and is cantilevering off of a bracket at the middle, and we're able to bury an LED in that, right in that moment. So just you'll get a glow at the edge of that canopy, and just not possible with, I mean, literally not even close to possible with any other technology other than LEDs, and they're, it's in dialogue with the glass, it's in dialogue with the materiality of the glass, it's just a really different kind of light fixture in that case. But I do think this relationship, the material properties of, so it's not just illumination, but it's this light in dialogue with materials that I think is kind of starts to posit a way forward of integration. That I think that's what you're getting at when you talk about volumes of light. But yeah, I do think it starts to posit a way forward for that in an interesting way.
Yeah, I would agree completely. Is that then it takes it out of the vocabulary of light fixture and embeds it in the broader sort of attempt at spatial definition and experience. And I think that's when I think it will start to get interesting.
So just talking about kind of then spatial experience, Raymond, do you have any comments to add to that? Because obviously that's really the area that you've spent the last years looking at.
Yeah, well, I would say again, in the spatial component must be too predictive, and the dynamics, light dynamics must be just a little bit unpredictable, like natural light does. And in addition to, you say it's becoming interesting, I also think that the temporal aspect of having a color temperature changing over the day, like the sun does, is the other area. Since George also told us that with the new LEDs we are able to mimic a natural spectrum, and now an easy, straightforward technological thing to do is to have your, say, bed lamp that you use, the lamp near your bed that you use in the morning perhaps to read, and in the evening as well, to present more reddish light in the evening and more bluish light in the morning. Bluish light is suppressing melatonin, so it makes you more alert, and you can't use that late night. Late night you don't want to have your melatonin suppressed because you want to go to sleep. So it's then better to use the same LED, but just have a different wavelength aspect. And that dynamic part of light is, well, another area where I think we can make the artificial light so much more natural. Don't know whether that's really a question to you, but it's the question to your first question that I never answered on the circadian.
I was going to come back to you because you tried to avoid that one. So okay,
so,
you're saved now. So.
Okay, good.
I mean, I think what you just described, the kind of, I mean, even in the very sort of simple, let's say, idea of the bedside lamp, I think the augmentation of experience that these different tools allow us, I mean, that's really what it's not an either or, it's getting towards an augmentation with all these amazing tools that we have at our disposal. So.
Well, in some respects, the light expressions that I like the best, with LEDs mostly, are the ones that are not looking at replicating natural light phenomena, but are looking at replicating, say, wind phenomena or some other aspect of nature that is independent of its light quality. And I think that those for me amplify my experience of nature by the use of light. And I think that for me is also an interesting area for experimentation.
So just to understand a little bit more about that. So, for example, in one of the projects that you presented there, the main example where we're looking into a courtyard, I can't imagine there's a lot of wind that gets into that space. So, is that the kind, just as an example, the kind of situation where that might be appropriate? Somehow make some reference to movement, for example.
Yeah, and well, and in fact, on that Battery City project that I showed you with the heliostats, those heliostats are about 8 foot by 8 foot. They're big flat panels of glass, and when you get even a relatively modest wind, they flutter, right? Not much. But when you project that fluttering out, 100 meters, 150 meters, it actually is quite noticeable. It's not, and so all of a sudden, it's not just telling you about the sun is out and it's being redirected here to this spot, but it's also telling you that at least at that elevation, there's wind. And if you looked at it closely enough over enough of a period of time, all of a sudden it would be a reference. You would start to look at it, and all of a sudden light is being used not just to identify the conditions, the cloud conditions, sky conditions on the outside, but also to engage you in a broader exposure to environmental conditions, period.
Yeah, can I follow up on this? I was thinking, and that's a spatial aspect as well, if there's one reflection, is it the case? So we are used to having the sun going from left to right and having our cast shadows following that pattern. Is it the case? I'm not sure. You may have looked at that. If there's one reflection, may it be the case that in some living areas, some homes, the sun actually goes from right to left?
Sure.
And is that disruptive or is it fascinating? What was your emotion when you first saw
I
that?
think it would depend on the degree to which you perceive that as a sun pattern, right? If you just perceive it as a moving light pattern, then you would probably, it would enter that part of that 2% of your, the zillions of, interactions between your eyes and your brain that you don't notice, or you do notice, right? It wouldn't enter that. But if you could identify it very clearly as the path of the sun in reverse, that would be very disturbing. That would be kind of neat. That would be worth exploring. Sure. Yeah.
I mean, just to pick up on the, again, back to our theme of man-made and nature. I think the presence of natural phenomenon within these man-made constructs is again just a sort of fascinating third. I would still argue for the third condition always being present. I mean, if we take Times Square, maybe you could argue that's the most man-made place on the planet. But I would encourage you to go to Times Square on a rainy day and see what that light looks like reflected on a surface of water in the pavement, and the very strange spatiality of night that emerges in that moment. And it is, even in this spot, which just feels like nature couldn't be further away from it, there's still a phenomenon that occurs there. Or walking through Times Square in a downpour, and what does that light look like through the rain? It is, to me, just this fascinating third condition that I think, again, is what we're kind of our vehicle of research.
Okay, so I actually had in mind, this, Derek has a question. Are there any, as we're sort of getting through this dialogue, actually, are there any kind of questions from the audience at all? Yeah, we've got somebody at the back here. Yeah, I'll give you my, well, Derek will take you the microphone.
It hinges off of the third condition. I love that, thanks. So what do you guys want to see in the future, and you can't use the word LED?
Great question.
George? I think the microphone's working. I'm not sure my brain is wrapped around that question yet. What do we want to see in the future and not use the word LED?
Even if it's a part, is there a gadget that would help your
Oh.
career right now?
Oh, boy.
A measuring instrument, a rainbow measuring instrument?
Gee, I'm kind of trying to, does somebody have a good answer? An answer to that? I'm drawing a blank.
Darkness.
The new frontier.
Well, I do think that I'm sorry. I do think that we are leaving behind the 12 hours of night and trying to occupy every living moment with photons. And I think that that is so fundamentally unnatural that it just serves to further distance our already alienated bodies and minds and psyches from natural cycles. And so I think that the degree to which we can explore darkness in architectural space, or in particular in public space, I think is extremely important. And it doesn't mean that there's no light, but it means that it's light that then allows you to perceive darkness in a new way. I mean, Peter Zumthor's, his baths. It's not about the light. The light is simply used in service of an exploration of darkness. And I think that is something we need a lot more of.
And perhaps just to add to that, maybe this idea of darkness, it's also about knowing when to have appropriate darkness and an appropriate light as well. Well, we kind of touched on the kind of whole circadian system there, but didn't go into any detail. But it's only just we're only kind of just at the beginning of that whole discussion. We've talked a lot about kind of the visual role of light, but the whole discussion about what we kind of know and don't know about the non-visual role, we're just really at the beginning there. So I think, appropriate darkness and appropriate light is definitely what I would want to see.
Yeah, I would just make one comment about the last figure I had that showed the logarithmic growth in light as the cost comes down. And if you follow that kind of logic, there's going to be an awful lot of light around. And it bothers me too. I mean, we started off, one of the motivations, we worked with the Department of Energy and talked about how much we could save. And I had a comment of how much energy we could save if you made these projections. And switching from conventional lighting to LEDs would save the equivalent of 50 large nuclear power plants in this country alone. There's about 100, and that's about 20% of the electricity. And so you say, okay, that's great. But if you believe this curve that has been going on forever, and you end up using a lot more light than you did in the past, you're actually going to burn a lot more electricity with taking advantage of your new technology and things you can do that you couldn't do before than you're ever going to save. So it's kind of an interesting dilemma as to what's going to happen. But that curve has been going on. The cost is going to come down. Clearly, LED costs are going to come down another order of magnitude and more. And it's going to drive that curve, I think. And so that's a very interesting discussion and a concern, I guess, to some extent.
Building off of that, actually, and volleying the question back to George, I know for myself growing up, where we had incandescent lights, you learned to shut the light off when you left the room. So there are social patterns that were built into just how we lived. And I find now, with the plethora of technology and gadgets and gizmos, there seems to be less of a forward consciousness about unplugging devices and conserving energy. And I've also heard reports, this not highly scientific, that there are actually many LEED buildings and buildings that were designed around with technology and advanced thinking, and that during their design phase were measured to be huge, conserving, thoughtful designs, but then in the post-occupancy reports, it's been revealed that they're actually consuming more energy. So there seems to be a disparity in, I would say, probably our social transition of understanding how to use or deploy technology in an appropriate fashion. So within all the great research that you've been doing, looking at LEDs, and I assume you talk to other scientists and researchers about other trends or forecasts or needs, are there specific energy-related topics or research that may be taking place now to address some of the driver loads and various things that we're contending with, as a result of some of these newer technologies?
Sure. I'm not sure I have that question either.
The answer is no.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I guess I don't really. I was trying to extract a short question out of that, and I didn't get it.
I didn't form a short question. Well, I'll phrase it a little differently, because and as you touched on, with the new technologies, if I look at incandescent as the opposite, it runs off of line voltage. There's nothing intelligent about it. The electrical current goes through the filament, it heats it, it produces visible light, and so on.
Yeah.
That's what we've known for a long time. With all discharge sources, now solid state sources, we've got ballasts and transformers and drivers and so on. We've got low voltage, we've got DC versus AC. So these are incredibly complex systems that also, as a result of these extra elements, are pulling power, they're drawing power and energy. So are there ways in which we're thinking holistically about buildings that you're involved with to truly conserve energy and simplify the kind of layers of technology that are required to use LEDs and other sources right now?
Okay, well, the short answer to that question is no, in the sense that we are really, from the LED side, focused on is higher efficiency, lower cost, which is good.
At the source.
At the
when
source.
When the source is consuming.
Now, your point is certainly a good one. You walk around your house, turn all the lights off, and walk around your house at night, and count the LEDs that are on all the little indicators that are on all the power boxes and the stereo equipments and the telephone and everything else. And you don't need a night light, because there's plenty of LEDs on to light the whole house in various colors. So that certainly is a trend, and it's, to me, to an extent, worrisome. I've had the last figure was supposed to be this globe spinning at night with the lights shining on it, and it's a beautiful thing, but you'd hate to see that whole thing blasting away at you illuminated. You'd like to see the technology used to where it gives people a better life in those regions that are dark, where kids can study at night and take advantage of that. You don't spill so much because you're doing it, but you don't just use the resource because it's there and it's cheap and you can startle somebody when they come out of a building with this huge wall of light. And I think there's a concern. I don't know that there's much of an effort anywhere to control it that I know of. Maybe somebody else knows of something, but I don't. It's still just evolving, and it'll be interesting to see what happens if there'll be, well, I'm sure there are codes about lighting. There's codes about where you can put lights. So there are some codes, but maybe some of those things need to be, rethought about. Because LEDs do good thing in street lighting. LEDs do a good thing. They don't spill light off into houses along the street. You don't lose as much light reflected up. You do get reflected light, but you don't have hot spots because you can distribute the light evenly where you want it. So you don't get so much reflected light. So it's all good things, but then you find 10 other things to do with it, and is that is that what we want to do with the planet or not? It's a good question.
I had a question. I have got a question. Oh, so there's a question at the front. Go for it.
If it's a good time, sure. Yeah, actually, I wanted to raise the point about biodiversity, which seems strange sometimes to bring up in this kind of a context. But there's a lot of talk, obviously, about the effect of artificial night lighting on wildlife systems and ecology. But when we talk about replicating natural light, or trying to do those kind of things, or even talking about photons and vision, which seem to me qualitatively different in some ways, the problems. In terms of what LEDs can do, I think exploring that lower range of the potential is absolutely critical. Because without biodiversity, there's no point in sustainability. It's a waste of time, without looking at what happens to ecological systems. And with the extension of artificial night light and the way it's going, with this curve and with this, the cheapness of it, the way it's coming, by all accounts, that's going to have a drastic effect on wildlife systems. Drastic. Whether it's, in a local sense or whether it's in a migratory sense with birds. The point I'm trying to make at the end of all this is that with animal sensory ecology, there's a need for research, because it's qualitatively different from human perception in many ways. Sure. But also in terms of night, when we talk about replicating natural lighting systems, we're really talking about replicating starlight and what happens in those environments. We talk about rainbows and cataloging rainbows. That's fantastic. Can we do rainbows at night, the kind that come off the moon? Or the kind, they're there, we just don't perceive them as humans because we're not in those environments and we don't have that kind of perceptual systems. But qualitatively speaking, they exist. And so it seems to me that in getting back to the idea of research, both in terms of vision and in terms of the photonic effect on wildlife, and separating those off, there's a need to think in very scotopic vision kind of ways, or photopic vision types of ways, to get into what these effects actually are, so we can maintain biodiversity, which by all accounts is an enormous problem right now.
Well, there is, as I'm sure you're well aware, that there is quite a bit of research that goes on in that area in terms of the turtles being able to come in and lay eggs and get back and not be distracted by the street lights, so changing the street lights so they don't have a blue component or whatever. There's certain, there's people that worry about that kind of thing. And I suspect there'll be more of it. Now, with evolving technology, you're going to have this interplay. And
well, I guess in a positive side too, and to smile about it, there's a lot of money to be made here. Because sure. If, with different types of animals, and the key is always, because it's such a complex subject, because there's no such thing as an animal, right? There's, millions of species that respond differently.
Right.
The key is going to be finding different applications of the technology for different key species in different biomes. That's the way that it's going to go forward, if it goes forward in a proper way. So, it seems like there's a way. Turtles are one great example. They're the poster child for it right now. But it really extends on everywhere down to frogs that'll hunt by starlight. There's all sorts of wonderful opportunities. So, anyway.
Yep.
What is an organic LED?
Well, that's the OLED is the short name for that, and it basically an LED that's made out of a plastic. Think of it as a plastic sheet that's an LED, so it's carbon-based system, and as opposed to the materials we're using, like gallium nitride, things like that, are non-carbon-based systems. So these are inorganic LEDs and organic LEDs. So that's what it is, and it just refers to a technology that can be built into that sheet. Very interesting technology. I talk in response to a question.
Or is it older? Is it?
It's organic technology is newer. Thank you. Is a newer technology, and it's made a lot of progress in a short time. But the projections suggest that it will not be as efficient as the inorganic technology, and most projections suggest that it will be less cost-effective. It'll get better. Its cost will come down too, but it's going to be very hard to compete on a lumen per dollar basis, as I mentioned earlier. So I feel, as a workhorse technology. It's not like you have LEDs now and then you will have organic LEDs replacing LEDs. I think they will fit in niches, and there may be some sizable niches, but LEDs are so efficient. I mean, we're making blue LEDs that are over 70, the best are over 70% efficient, energy efficiency. When you add the phosphor, it comes down. But the efficiency is getting so high, it's just hard to do much better. And the lifetime is really good. And so these things are hard to beat. So they have been called, in fact, Holonyak, the guy calls it the ultimate lamp. He's written an article talking about the ultimate lamp. And that feels to me roughly right. They continue to evolve, and I just don't see the next technology on the horizon. But OLEDs are a version that'll probably be applicable for some places where cost isn't a big issue, and very thin sheets and maybe flexibility are important. But displays are a great application for OLED.
I guess it kind of comes down to the kind of appropriate role of natural lights and electric lights. And so it's coming back to this idea of the kind of dialogue. So luminous talks as well. Not sort of saying well, there are of course some situations where natural light is better than electrolyte, and you gave a very good example of that today. And some situations where electric light is kind of the appropriate way to go, and within that are different technologies. I'm kind of looking to Derek. How are we doing for time?
We're in great shape. I think
Okay.
we can certainly direct more questions here to, or
Yeah.
it's great to open up to the audience.
Okay.
And then Sarah, you're watching online as well. Okay, so if we get some questions there, we can.
Okay, great.
respond.
I was really interested earlier when Raymond was talking about the multimodal, the use of multimodal things to increase perception of light and direct attention towards one visual stimulus over another. I was wondering if maybe Davidson and Noah could speak about how they use multimodal techniques in their design to direct attention towards visual and lighting features.
The short answer is that we don't. And I actually think that the sound connection is not the one that I would think of first. But I mean, given what I've heard today, it makes perfect sense. I mean, I think I would have thought thermal, certainly. Some sort of skin response would be something that is explicitly a part of experience of light. For instance, when you go down to Battery Park City and you sit under that reflected light from the heliostats, you get warm, and palpably so. So your understanding of the light is traveling at least on a couple of channels. And so I certainly think it is something to explore, because certainly the heat content of the light can often be a very positive feature of it. And frankly, when we were thinking about the heliostats, we were mostly thinking about the dead of winter, and where if you could find a patch of light in that park and experience not only light, which is a rare thing, but heat at the same time, then it would be like those wonderful times when you walk onto the subway and you sit in the corner seat there and it has the heater underneath it. I think all of those cars are gone, but it's a wonderful kind of joyful experience that you have. So I certainly think that it's there, but it's not something that we've really anticipated, and we've certainly never anticipated in terms of sound, and therefore it does open up a door, I think, to a variety of haptic experiences that are related to light that use other channels. And I think that's a very, very interesting idea, because then we're talking about it having a much broader impact on your perception, which I think is the key. And then if you can get, maybe if you put a little Brahms in with the half the photons, you can get people to perceive the space as being brilliantly lit. I mean, maybe not, but I think that it's a very interesting sort of channel of engagement.
Yeah, I agree. You may be right that light-sound combination is not the most appropriate combination. What I did is, what is a good combination is, with sound, is a vestibular system. So I made solutions where I move your vestibular system, your balancing system, and then together with sound, with the relaxing, breaking C-wave sound, actually people fall asleep more easily than without. And then the multimodal is better than the unimodal. So vestibular sound is a good one. With light, temperature is a good one, but temperature is not, the temporal resolution of temperature change is a little harder to test in the lab. But yeah, well, we are evolving, and that may be something if the technology allows to have a wristband that gives you that temperature change together with, for example, brightness change. That would be a great combination. Yeah, good point. Thank you for making the multimodal point. Yeah.
I mean, I would say in our work, to a certain degree, I would make the same response that it's something, it points to a direction, sort of for further investigation. I will say, I think in a few instances, I think particularly about the use of water in our projects, and there's actually, like, for example, in that Korea House project, I think I ended it with an image of a small little fountain that's at the front entry. And that actually becomes a light fixture in the evening, and it has a very slow trickle of water, and that's kind of your sign of entry into that. So that's a very sort of very small scale, but purposely very small scale. I mean, we're intending to create a sense of intimacy as you enter the building and approach the building. And I think the combination there of the light and the sound. So I don't want to throw out your light and sound. I'm not so sure. We're not necessarily. It's different type of sound. It's maybe
right. And this reminds me of Davidson's own waterfall. So you remind me of that point. So the sound your waterfall makes could be synchronous with light reflections or specular highlight reflections, and then it is synchronous and it is light sound. Yeah.
And I also, when I was trying to explain some of the phenomenological aspects of the water underneath that horizontal skyscraper project, and David was getting at this as well with his question. It's certainly engaging a multimodal sensory experience. There's zero doubt in my mind it's doing that. It's not. I think the water is a good. There's many dimensions of haptic dimensions to water, which actually sort of all our projects have little bodies of water in them, just very much because of that. Phenomenological aspect of it, but I think it's something that it's just something that's sort of posits a fascinating further avenue for research.
And can I one more physiological point? So there is really this synergetic effect of two modes that help each other. And that's because we have particular cells in our parietal cortex that are especially devoted to sense, to detect synchrony into perceptual modalities. So this immersive effect or synergetic effect of having two modalities that are synchronous is really there also because we have those cells that detect that and then overrule other attentional distractions. So there is physiological proof.
There's a couple more questions there. Yeah.
Is what you're talking about an example of what they're talking in a word. I believe it came out of the autistic crowd. Now it's seeping into our domains. Synesthesia.
Well, I didn't have that in mind, but I think that's all consistent with it. True. I should think about it more to see where the consistency breaks. But yeah, it's as far as I think now, it's consistent. And synesthesia means that you see, say, numbers and you attach a color to them. And synesthetic people are often quicker in doing calculations because they have this extra feature. When they add numbers, they see colors to the numbers. Yeah, and it's in a way a multimodal effect. Yeah, true. But I didn't have that in mind.
I'm interested that this conversation landed back on this multimodal issue, because I saw it as very much being a connection point across the different talks, and in trying to better define this third component, the and between nature and man-made. I wonder if it makes sense to me that the research that you've done to identify the sensory stimuli when it becomes synchronized as having a more intense awareness in the part of the viewer, that would be because that's the way nature typically operates, that the wind blows across the lake, the light reflects off the water in a specific way, you hear it, you feel the wind, you see the light. So it seems that maybe what we're proposing as this third component is an understandable but unpredictable stimuli synchronization that can occur through water, but also through light interacting with material. But the unpredictability is important, but the understandability of it is. And with many control systems, as their electric lighting control systems as they're currently designed, they remain unconnected to any other sort of reference point. So it's not just change for change's sake. It's about change that provides orientation.
Well, how beautiful, yeah. You put it better than I could have done. I completely agree.
Well, I would add that I think that Steve Hall's office's choice with water deals almost directly with the intermodality problem up front, insofar as water can be a gas, a liquid, or a solid, and you explore all of those conditions. I can imagine that museum in Seoul, with fog sort of floating off the top of it, and so. But I think that to try to find a corresponding architectural material that can express that many different modalities is probably impossible. So I think you're back to, at least in this instance, a natural source. It's not that you can't reproduce each one of those with other materials, but to find one material that over the course of its change in modality, which is being driven by climate and temperature and wind and all that other kind of stuff. Never mind reflection, refraction, transmission. All of those are built into it as well. You're not going to find probably a more interesting and variable material, multimodal material.
I know there's a question. Yeah.
I think this will be the last question. Raymond, you talked about circadian effect. Can you say a little more the difference between natural and artificial light?
Yeah. Your circadian system is typically not affected by emotion and fascination and phenomenology, as we talked about. It's really a hormonal, a molecular piece of our brain, and the pacemaker sends signals to slave pacemakers in the rest of your body. So the SCN pacemaker has direct connections to your liver, kidney. It determines your blood pressure variation over the day, and that's all molecular. And in principle, it's every day the same. And whenever a prediction comes out, when you are really balanced in your life and you do every day the same, your pacemaker will see it's correct in its predictions because it measures also the melatonin level and other hormones. And then there's a dopamine release. So it makes you feel better if your predictions are good. Now say you go into the plane, travel a couple of time zones, and then suddenly the predictions of your pacemaker are off. And that often leads to mood disorders. And now your question is, what's the difference between natural light and the light we are exposed to? And that's particularly the blue part. It's the blue part of the spectrum of light that suppresses melatonin and that evokes melanopsin, which is a new receptor found since, say, 2000. And it's only the blue part of the light that's able to do that. So the short wavelengths, red light doesn't affect melanopsin and doesn't affect melatonin. So the difference is the blue part. That's the short. And I can elaborate on this, but if this is an answer already to your question, that may do.
I just had one comment that I was triggered by something that was said, and that is one thing that technology can do, the sensor technology, is turn the lights off or turn them down. You know, we talk about all this waste light, but now by adding detectors everywhere, you can dim or put out the lights where you don't need them, where people aren't. And that's a big effect. You can really save a lot of energy doing that, and it makes a lot of sense to do that, and that is being implemented more and more. So that's something that helps a little bit with your wanting more darkness.
Just to pick up on that and back to which I think was addressing the question of sort of what would you like to see in the future. I'm not going to try and top the poetry of darkness because I quite like that. but I will say that I do think it's this total systems that you're starting to allude to in this response. I was fascinated, and we are fascinated by, what you said about the relationship between PVs and LEDs. And there you're starting to really get at the and condition also, just in a sort of more hard-nosed technological sense at that point. And that may, the possibility that could lead you to a low-voltage house. Right. That starts to become fascinating, and the way then, and how you then could express those ideas in a more poetic way. I mean, we've never yet implemented this idea, but we've had an idea of a facade lighting in our projects that's an index of the amount of energy that the PV panels gained over the day. Right. Something like that. Or I always. When you talked about wind, I can't help but think of Toyo Ito's Tower of the Winds, where this wonderful, highly sort of technological, artificial project that's driven by a natural phenomenon, and in particular the fact that one is both the wind from just the environment, but also it's an exhaust shaft for the subway tunnel, so that it's the wind coming from that, and I think the more that can start to register and inform things, it really can be fascinating. And then I don't think you're necessarily dialing up the unpredictability knob, but you're actually engaging in those natural systems. Yeah, and it's an experiential thing, which I think could be a fascinating way forward.
Yeah, I wonder if with the sensor technology too, I mean, you can have the sensor just turn on and turn off the LEDs when you're there or not. Maybe you could add something interesting to that, some variability or something, so it does something besides just click on. So it does something more. So
in a very pragmatic way, that studio building in Glasgow, it sort of has lines of light effectively parallel to the facade, and those are all on dimmers and all on sensors, and basically the more daylight you have, the dimmer is controlling that. So it's not just sensors, but it's occupancy, but also registering the light levels in the room, and so you may have your suspended LED fixture that's in your deeper floor plate has more output than your one right by the window, and that the two are working. Again, it's a
Yeah.
very sort of pragmatic technological example, but it's interesting. It's natural phenomenon influencing that artificial.
Yeah, I just want, but you could introduce as much uncertainty as you want into that with your chaos knob on your.
I can't help feeling that actually that's quite a good. I'm also looking for Derek, who's maybe as well. But I can't help feeling that's probably quite a good sort of place to leave this discussion. So if I just add, I'll just sort of add a kind of few comments on that, and then probably also hand over to Derek as well, because of course the whole theme is about nature and made, and about the dialogue, uncertainty as well, and kind of sort of moving forwards, and everything kind of working better together, which this whole discussion this afternoon has been all about. And certainly from my side, it's it has been a really fascinating discussion. That's just one element of it in terms of the actual kind of content. The second part, which I kind of just want to also mention, is also the kind of the dialogue that's been kind of going on between Phillips and with Parsons, which kind of, and for me that's kind of another dimension which is also fascinating and is developing. And I'm looking forward to that continuing. So, Derek, have you got any words to say?
Sure. Well, first of all, it's always nice when you moderate a panel discussion and you just sit back and listen, and the conversation happens, and the engagement of the audience is part of that. So this has been fantastic, and I think if I reflect back to last spring when Matthew and I had a very nice dinner in New York, and we were planning this event and discussing themes with the idea that having a sequential theme that builds off of the first event could be interesting. And then we quickly listed created a list of individuals that we thought would be interesting counterpoints in that presentation. And that list of individuals that we made on that first night of our discussion, they're sitting in front of you right now. So this event has evolved in a kind of a very easy, fluid manner, not without a lot of work that has gone into it by a lot of individuals, staff, faculty, and students at Parsons and on Phillips' end as well. This has been a really lovely collaboration, and something I think that is rich, certainly for our institution, I think for Phillips as well. And I would say we both want this to be a valuable moment for the industry, to collect information, to collect individuals for this kind of discourse, and then to coalesce this content in a manner that can be disseminated and recorded and then used by others. So I look forward to future events. Hopefully we can make that happen. So with that, let's thank our speakers for their contribution today. Thank you very much. And I will personally, would like to acknowledge, not by name, there's too many right now to list, but the various students that have helped with this event on a variety of levels, the reception that follows, staff in the office that dealt with my craziness and disorganization. It's really been a team effort on many levels, and it's amazing how much effort it takes to pull something like this off. So I greatly value that to everybody that contributed to this. Matthew, do you have any final words?
No, but yeah, to thank everybody who's, of course, taken part here this afternoon, and not forgetting at all. It's a little bit easy to forget, but we're not forgetting at all the people who are online virtually as well. So thank you to all of you as well, taking a really active part.
So with that, we can bring this to a close and then make the transition to the last segment, which is the reception down the street. So thank you for coming.